Fantastic. What a treat and a great way to start us off. Next up, I have the distinct honor of introducing His Excellency Pedro Sanchez, who is the President of the Government of Spain. Now, some of you probably know President Sanchez will actually be hosting the next major NATO summit, which will take place in June in Madrid. It will be a consequential summit for sure, because it will mark the release of NATO's next strategy. Some of you NATO nerds in here have already said strategic concept, which is what we call NATO's next strategy. It will guide the alliance for the decade to come. So lots to come out on that. We've also already mentioned the possibility that at the summit we might be discussing 2 more members joining NATO, Finland and Sweden perhaps. So there will be a lot to watch for. Let's hear what President Sanchez has to say about the upcoming summit and the role of all of you in shaping NATO's future.
It is my pleasure to address this NATO Youth Summit only some weeks ahead of hosting the Madrid NATO Summit in late June. This edition takes place in very challenging times when the Euro-Atlantic security architecture is being dramatically questioned by Putin's war against Ukraine. The invasion of Ukraine is not only a violation of its territorial integrity and sovereignty, it is also a frontal attack to the core values of NATO and to the security architecture that has for so many years ensured peace and prosperity in Europe. We are facing the greatest threat to global peace and security since the Second World War. This is a turning point in our history. We must make the right decisions because they will profoundly shape the future for the generations to come, such as yours. First, we must maintain the unity of those of us who believe in democracy, in the rules-based order, and in the protection of human rights and freedoms. Unity is our best deterrent tool. With our unity, with the unity of all NATO allies and that of many other countries in the international community, we will send a clear message and forceful message in defense of the values and principles in which we believe. Second, we must remember that security is the precondition that makes our way of life possible. It is what feeds a healthy democracy and supports our economy. This war has reminded us that we cannot take our security for granted. It is true that this war has high cost. However, I can assure you that doing nothing and allowing Putin to sweep through Ukraine would be the end of Europe. Europe itself is at stake, not only the present of Europe, but also its future, your future. And make no mistake, security does not come for free. We will have to invest in defense and security in the coming years. If we want to stop the war, our best option for the future is to strengthen our deterrence. For that, we need modern, powerful, credible, and available military capabilities. Achieving these capabilities requires high defense spending. It is an expensive policy, but even more expensive in economic and human terms is to fight an armed conflict. Third, we must make the Madrid NATO summit in late June a great success. It will definitely be a historic summit for our alliance. It will define the organization's strategy for the next decade. If we want to leave a legacy of freedom, democracy, and peace, we have to make decisions to strengthen our alliance and provide it with the adequate tools and capabilities. We have to show our determination to make it fit for purpose for the 21st century. At the beginning of the 2021, a group of young leaders presented a remarkable document with their views of what the NATO 2030 process should take it into account. This document had a very inspiring title, Embrace the Change, Guard the Values. These 6 words contain the goals that should guide us in the coming years. To prepare ourselves for the deep change in our environment, but without forgetting the values and principles for which we stand. These are precisely the goals included in the Washington Treaty 73 years ago. They remain valid today: democracy, individual freedom, and the rule of law. I can assure you that they will continue to inspire and guide our action in the coming future. We have chosen to be on the side of peace and international law and not on the side of force and global chaos. We will uphold our commitment to our shared values and principles, but we need to do it with you. I call upon you to help us in this collective endeavor. Thank you very much.
Well, many thanks to President Sanchez for that message. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our very first panel, which I think will cover the most pressing topic on everyone's minds. We've already talked about it a little bit, the future of European security. As Russia tries to redraw borders by force with its unprovoked and unjustified war in Ukraine, what will this mean for our Euro-Atlantic institutions? And what about the wider rules-based global order? These are tough questions, but we have a great panel to help us answer them, including some folks that are already joining us on stage, and as well as some folks that will join us online. Again, I will encourage everyone to go into the app and submit your questions there. Our moderator will continue, just as I did in our last session, to work in your questions that come in. So don't be shy. Please send your thoughts our way. And now I will hand it over to our moderator, Amy Mackinnon, who is National Security and Intelligence Reporter at Foreign Policy. Amy, thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you, Lauren, for that wonderful introduction. Hello, everyone. Good morning from Washington and good afternoon to those of you joining us from Europe. My name is Amy Mackinnon. I'm a national security reporter with Foreign Policy, and I'm delighted to be your host for this incredibly timely discussion about the future of European security. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February sent shockwaves around the world. Unspeakable images of bombed out cities and mass graves have evoked some memories of the darkest chapters of Europe's 20th century history, images that many of us would have hoped were a thing of the past. It has also posed a direct challenge to the international security order, and the stakes could not be higher for Ukraine's future and for that of European security. But just as the destruction of World War II opened the way for a new conception of Europe, the shock of the Russian invasion of Ukraine offers the possibility of revitalizing the European security order and the challenge of navigating an increasingly contentious relationship with Russia. But what should that order look like? The war in Ukraine has served as a clarifying moment for the alliance, which is now more united in its core mission. But as it approaches the Madrid summit and the release of NATO's next strategic concept, which will guide the alliance's goals for the decades to come, several questions remain. In our session today, we're going to explore the short and long-term implications of the new security reality in Europe and how NATO should adapt and respond. Joining me to explore these pressing issues, I'm very delighted to welcome our distinguished guests. We have General John Allen, President of the Brookings Institution. General Allen is a retired US Marine Corps four-star general and former commander of the NATO International Security Assistance Force and US forces in Afghanistan. Delighted to also welcome Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, the former Minister of Defense of the Federal Republic of Germany. We also have Captain Thorben Pfeifer, aide-de-camp to the Director General of the NATO International Military Staff, and of course, Alina Polyakova, the President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis. And before we dive in, I just want to echo Lauren's reminder earlier that you can submit your own questions, whether you're joining us online or in person, using the Summit's app. So given that we have so much to discuss, I want to give our speakers the opportunity to offer some remarks to help set the scene. I'd ask you all, much as this is a very weighty topic, to keep your remarks as brief as possible, and then around 2 minutes, and then we can really get into things. I'd like to start with General Allen. General, could you put Russia's invasion of Ukraine into context for us? Just how has this changed the security landscape for the NATO allies?
Well, first, it's terrific to be with this forum. I believe in it very strongly. The NATO Youth Summit and this forum, continuing forum, is very, very important to the future, obviously. Let me just show you a quick picture. This is the front of my house in Mount Vernon, Virginia. And on homes all over America, we're flying the Ukrainian flag out of sympathy for and support to and solidarity with Ukraine. Look, the whole rest of the world, the the future of our economic future, the security of Europe, the security of much of the rest of the world relies on a stable security environment in Europe. And the Russian invasion of an unprovocative, peaceful proto-democracy, Ukraine was getting it sorted out and it was well on the way to being a fully functioning democracy. The unprovoked invasion of Ukraine is a direct assault upon the security of the Euro-Atlantic region, the European continent, and that has ripple effects that can affect security completely around the world. Now, as an American general, as an American who commanded a major NATO force in combat, my attention isn't just focused on the Euro-Atlantic region. Clearly, East Asia and Asia is also an important part of American security considerations. And the 4 February joint statement between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, which ties China and Russia together in their own vision of the future of the security environment of the 21st century, has to be at the heart of our thinking about going forward. So as Russia and China have come together with their own vision of human rights and democracy and sovereignty, with their own view of NATO, with the whole issue of the denazifying of Europe, with their intention to work together on issues associated with internet security and security environment writ large, this is a much bigger issue. Even though as horrible as it is, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is something that should have our attention and the Ukrainians should have our support. While it affects the Euro-Atlantic security arrangement, it is a much bigger, it's a global issue, and we should be attentive to that more broadly. And then finally, two quick points. We need to think in Europe more carefully, in NATO in particular, the EU, and any potential members of Europe, about economic security as well as military security. The challenges that we face today in terms of bringing the private sector together with the resilience of our civil society and our legitimate security concerns, those have not been brought together as they need to. And so the evolving security concept, or the strategic concept, which we hope to roll out at the Madrid summit in June, that has to account for the economic security of Europe and the Euro-Atlantic region going forward. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks, General. I'd now like to turn to Annegret. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has triggered a major strategic shift in Germany in an astonishingly short space of time, from the ramping up of defense spending to plans to wean Germany off of Russian energy supplies. What do you make of these shifts in German security and defense policy that we've seen over these past 2 months?
So first of all, hello to everybody. It's great to be with you here. And let me talk, so what's on the table right now? I think today it's day 64 of Russia's unjustified, brutal and devastating war against Ukraine. And Putin's attempts to reshape the world poses dark questions to us, not just in Germany, but all over the world. We know that Putin will not succeed, but we also know that there is no possible return to the world order before February 2022. We now have to be determined about 2 big issues. First, what kind of world do we want to create? And second, are we really willing to shape and defend the world we prefer? My answer today is very clear. We will not leave the shaping of the world to dictators who are using military aggression and criminal wars to advance their imperial ambitions. We will not leave order to self-empowered lifetime rulers who deny to their people the liberty they crave and to exert violence and brutality at home and abroad. We, the like-minded allies in Europe, the United States and Canada, and our partners from the Indo-Pacific to the Middle East to Africa, do not have to agree on every single item, but we need to share the fundamental concepts on how we shape the world. If we accept this role, the starting point is quite simple. Our will and our determination need to be strong, really strong. We have to be ready to stand up against the enemies of a rules-based order, if necessary, also by military means. Let me quote Konrad Adenauer. Konrad Adenauer, as Chancellor leading post-war Germany into NATO, said in 1957, "We can restrain the world's aggressor only if he knows that if he were to aggression, the blowback would destroy himself." I know that sounds terrible, but it is realistic thinking. And as things stand, we must think realistically. For some Europeans in NATO, and especially for my country, Germany, this is still a deeply disturbing, challenging thought. But the reality is right in front of us. Russia's war against Ukraine asks for Zeitenwende. And the true turn of times can only mean that we support Ukraine now with all means to resist Russia's brutal aggression. And more fundamentally, that we Europeans have to become first-class military powers ourselves. That brings me to my last point. Security, it's a long game, a multi-layered one. If we want real security, we have to discuss security in the same context as, for example, climate change or sustainability. Security is an issue of generational justice, especially if security provides freedom. I ask you, the participants of the NATO Youth Summit, to be very tough with your governments at home. Make sure they understand the military side of generational justice. We need to make tough decisions today if we want a safe, free, self-determined, and dignified life in the future. That is what the Ukrainians are fighting for. And that is what we must be fighting for as well. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks. And there's a lot to unpack there that I'm looking forward to discussing with you as we go forward. I want to bring in Alina now. Alina, what is your assessment overall of the transatlantic community's response to the war thus far? What more should NATO allies be doing or not doing, perhaps?
Well, thank you so much for that question, Amy. And it's wonderful to see General Allen and AKK, as we all call the minister, and to be here with you for this important summit. A couple of thoughts on your question. One, this has been an unprecedented moment of unity for the alliance. There's no question about that. As John also pointed to, and I think as Madam Minister also pointed to, and as Secretary General said earlier in his remarks, Russia wanted to divide NATO with this war in Ukraine, and has gone the exact opposite. We have a NATO that is far more united, and in fact, countries like Finland and Sweden, who since the founding of NATO were determined to remain neutral and non-aligned, are now seriously considering being part of the alliance for their own collective defense and security. So Russia has started a new trend of potential expansion of NATO that we did not predict happening at this time. And frankly, it's given NATO purpose. And when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, we have to remember this war has been happening now for over 8 years. This is the most recent phase, is the most brutal, the most violent, the most atrocious stage of the war, but Ukraine has been at war for 8 years. And when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, that reignited NATO's purpose, that re-energized NATO, but we haven't seen the alliance united in the same way now. And I think it's not just on the security side. We've seen incredible cooperation with Europe, the United States, G7, and other allies and partners on sanctions and economic pressures on Russia, because we cannot face the brutality of what we see day in, day out in Ukraine as we think about this vision of never again. Never again will we allow genocide, will we allow human violence against innocent civilians be as brutal as we saw during World War II. And of course, what is happening in Ukraine today is exactly what we wanted to prevent. So I think this has been an incredibly united moment for the alliance. Obviously, there's more we can do. And here's, I come to just a quick second point. You know, we as democracies and as an alliance of 30 members, you know, this is not an authoritarian state. You know, it's not Mr. Putin gives an order and the military does what he says. No, we take time to make decisions. That is the nature of democracy, is the nature of a multilateral alliance. But what that also means is that in crisis situations, that means that we are often delayed because it takes time to organize, it takes time to make strategic decisions. I think now, over 2 months into the war, we now see a United States that's provided massive amounts of security assistance in a way that we didn't see at the beginning of the conflict. I think the US has now provided almost $4 billion in military aid to Ukraine. That's just since February 24th. We've seen the EU take a step towards that as well. And of course, we've seen countries like Poland, the Baltic states, Germany, almost every single EU member now delivering arms and assistance to Ukraine. But I think there's much more we need to do because right now we're in a critical moment in the war. And I can't underestimate or underemphasize how critical it is that Ukraine wins. You know, Secretary Austin said this very recently during his visit to Kiev with Secretary Blinken from the United States, that our goal as an alliance, not just as the United States, has to be driven by a vision of victory for Ukraine. Why? Why is that? Now, why should we not settle for Ukraine that is, let's say, divided and partitioned, as Germany, unfortunately, was for many decades? I think we learned from that experience that those walls, those kinds of divisions of countries, of democracies, don't work. And seeing the kind of atrocities that the Russian military has unleashed in Ukraine, it is a moral and ethical question whether we would be, as an alliance of democracies, content with that price of growing violence, more refugees, if Russia does end up occupying a part of Ukraine. Because what happens in Ukraine today will determine the future of European security order. As General Allen rightfully said, this is not just about Ukraine, this is about European security writ large, it's about global security. If we are able to ensure the Ukrainians can not just defend themselves, but regain their full territorial integrity, that will be a huge win, not just for NATO, not just for security, but for democracy. Because that's really what we're talking about here. We're not talking about one conflict to one country somewhere in Eastern Europe. We're talking about the future of the democratic order. We're talking about the future of democratic societies versus a very different vision for our societies driven by authoritarian visions. And I think all those young people who are listening, who are in the room in Brussels and NATO HQ, I think you really need to think, we all need to really think about collectively, what kind of world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world where we can enjoy all those things we've taken for granted, like moving across borders freely and being able to use our cell phones in any country, to say the very least, but to live in a world of peace and prosperity? That's really what's at stake. It's that vision of the world that's at stake in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Alina. I now want to turn to Thorben, who is joining us from Brussels, from NATO HQ, who's been waiting patiently. Welcome. Whilst Russia is likely to dominate our conversation today, I feel like I would be remiss if we didn't touch, at least briefly, on the pacing threat from China. And General Allen touched upon some of these things in his opening remarks, but how should the alliance balance this acute threat from Russia with this pacing threat from China? And what does this deepening Russia-China relationship mean for the alliance?
First of all, thank you very much. And as I saw some raised eyebrows here, because before the SecGen was sitting here and now they are asking themselves maybe what the junior captain is doing. I think it's good to have a military uniform worn by a young soldier under 35 here on stage. And Amy, thank you very much for the question. I think this balance is very delicate because the threat, the imminent threat, is on the table now, and everyone is thinking about Russia, and this will be reflected, as the SecGen said before, also in the strategic concept. But China is a very good example how we are entering now an era of blurred lines between the condition of peace, the condition of crisis, and the condition of war. Where are we now? We are delivering weapons to support the Ukraine. Are we part of this war now or not? Are we in a crisis? Is this still a condition of peace? And of course, China is always capable to prick us as an alliance and also as an single ally. And therefore, we have to be vigilant. And what my previous speakers have mentioned as well, we need to be coherent. This alliance is coherent as it never was before, to my mind. I'm like all of you here in the room, one of the post-Cold War generation, and we took peace for granted, and we have to be vigilant, not also concerning Russia, but also China, to act also under the threshold of war, under the threshold of a crisis. And we have seen the statistics. The most of the young people saying, okay, disinformation is a huge threat to us. And this is what I see at first in conjunction to China and the emerging threat from there. So a balance is very delicate to protect and shield our 1 billion people, but NATO is capable and NATO will be ready for this.
Thank you for those remarks, Captain. I'd like to stay with you for my next question. Something that many of our speakers have brought up is this remarkable unity that we have seen within the alliance in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But there are already cracks beginning to emerge, particularly when it comes to areas of critical national interest, such as energy security. What can be done to maintain unity within institutions such as NATO, but also the European Union? And what are the implications if this unity fractures further?
Yeah, coherence is the center of gravity. So we have the big institutions with very distinctive toolkits. We have NATO with a very unique military toolkit. We have the European Union with a very capable and very unique political toolkit. And we need to try to stand together and to merge it together as a complementary toolkit to give complex answers to complex questions. The same as we cannot give tactical answers to strategic questions. We need to answer in the future. So the coherence is the center of gravity. I can only stress it one more time.
Thank you, Captain. And as a reminder to our audience, you can submit your questions through the conference app. I'm already seeing some fantastic questions coming in, one of which I'm going to put to Alina. There's no names on the question, so thank you for whoever submitted this question anonymously. But somebody asks, can Russia ever be trusted again? What would our conditions be to reintegrate them to European security architecture, and what will NATO do if Russia actually succeeds in Ukraine?
That's a fantastic question. Unfortunately, given what's happening on the ground in Ukraine and what we're seeing in terms of massive human rights violations, war crimes, even potentially genocide, it's very difficult to see how we return to some sort of quote unquote normal partnership with Russia. I mean, to be very frank, we have tried over and over again as an alliance, as the United States, to engage Russia, to have a policy that is stable and reliable with Russia, to have a policy of reset with Russia, whatever you want to call it. We have tried to ensure that Russia can be a partner in the global world order. Mr. Putin has very clearly said with his invasion of Ukraine this February that he's not interested in that kind of partnership with the West, that he's interested in deploying military force against an innocent country that did nothing to provoke this kind of violence. And of course, what we've also seen is inside of Russia, the narrative has been, it's a different world that it seems like the Russian people are now living in because of the kind of disinformation that the Russian state media has been deploying to the Russian people. So the Russians do seem to, according to polls, or always take that with a grain of salt, an authoritarian state, obviously, do seem to be supportive of Mr. Putin's vision. So unfortunately, I think as long as we have this kind of authoritarian government led by someone like Mr. Putin in Russia, there is no return to business as usual. And I think this is really going to end up in a really bad place for Russia. Russia is not going to recover. Whatever happens on the ground in Ukraine, Russia as a country, the Russian people will suffer from this for a very, very long time. This is a huge strategic blunder by Mr. Putin himself, because first and foremost, he's destroying his own country at the same time as he's destroying Ukraine.
Thank you, Alina. I now want to bring Annegret back into the discussion. On the day that Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, you tweeted that you were angry at Germany's historic failure, which was the phrase you used. You said, "We have not prepared anything that would have really deterred Putin." Can I ask you to expand on that here? And what did you mean by historic failure?
This tweet was my very personal outcry of deep frustration. I grew up during the Cold War. My first political experience was the heated and very fundamental discussion about NATO's dual track decision, the deployment of Americans Pershing II missiles in Germany as a response to Soviet SS-20 missiles. That was a hugely successful decision. But later, we seem to have forgotten all lessons learned during this time. After the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, we all hoped, we all believed, me too, conflict between the West and Russia would be forever impossible. In 2014, Russia attacked Ukraine and occupied Crimea. And sure, NATO and we as its member states reacted to this aggression. Our intention was to put pressure on Putin's Russia and to prevent similar attacks on other countries. But we have to ask ourselves today, have we been successful? When we look at Ukraine today, we must accept that we have failed. We were too hesitant. We did too little, too late. And that includes, sadly, and especially my own country.
I want to stay with you for our next question. I mean, Ukrainian officials have repeatedly accused Germany of not doing enough to support Kiev in its war effort, accusing Germany of prioritizing its economy. We have seen some shifts in that this week with the decision to provide more heavy weaponry to Ukraine. But what do you make of these critiques from Kiev, and how do you assess the level of support that Germany has given to Ukraine in the war thus far?
So we must be aware the people in Ukraine right now are suffering unspeakable hardship, attacks, mass murder, rape, expulsion, the destruction of millions of lives and hopes of a whole country. Ukrainians are fighting for their lives, for their homeland, for their freedom, and by the way, for our freedom as well. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. There is no Article 5. There is no fighting all for one. That makes it even more pressing that we provide whatever is needed, including artillery and other heavy weapons. And it means we have to stop, especially as German, we have to stop financing Putin's war machine through our energy imports. And this as immediately as possible.
Thank you. I want to bring General Allen back into the conversation with us. General, the war in Ukraine has really laid bare exactly where the borders of NATO lie. I mean, President Biden has vowed to protect every inch of NATO territory. At the same time, of course, Ukraine has, with support from NATO allies, with military aid, but has been on its own in this fight. What do you see as, how do you see the relationship with countries along the border of NATO evolving after this crisis, after this war? What obligations does NATO have to countries along its borders which are not members of the alliance, but countries such as Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, Sweden, Finland, not members, but whose own security is inherently tied to that of alliance members?
Sure, it's a great question. Let me come to a couple things first. I want to congratulate Germany and that young captain. If Germany routinely produces captains like that, I think the future of NATO is in pretty good hands. And let me come to Alina's response to your question about trusting Russia. I hope we never trusted Russia, and I hope we never trust them again. Just look at the history, the modern history, Chechnya, Crimea. I was deeply involved in the Russian intervention in Syria, where I watched them bombing hospitals routinely, civilian centers, bread lines. They are not trustworthy at all. We should engage with them, but we should do it with our eyes wide open and understand the history of the Rus and what they will do and the lengths that they will go to defend themselves, which is playing out today every time we recover a village of Ukraine and see what they've done to the people. So we shouldn't have trusted them. We need to be very careful about ever thinking about that again. Engage, yes. Trust, no. With respect to the border of Ukraine, and depending on whether Ukraine ultimately becomes a NATO member or not, we've already seen under this Secretary General, and I have to speak very glowingly and very clearly. This Secretary General and the senior leadership of NATO have provided extraordinary leadership in this crisis to this point. And I really commend Jens Stoltenberg for what he's done. We're going to see higher readiness forces, larger numbers of higher readiness forces in what I will call the frontline states. And I think we should very seriously consider the potential petition for Finland and Sweden to come into NATO. There's a lot of thinking going on in both of those capitals right now, and the public view on becoming part of NATO has swung in favor of that idea. The issue is being run through Parliament, which is typical of those highly functioning democracies. And if they petition to come into NATO, they process through the membership action plan. We should expedite that and bring them in as quickly as possible. It really secures the northern flank of NATO in many ways. Now, people get very nervous about adding 830 miles of additional NATO border to the Russian frontier. Russians have I think, forfeited the right to have a concern about that, given what they are doing to Ukraine and what they're doing to the Ukrainian people. In Moldova, we should make it very clear that we'll support Moldovans in their continued desire for sovereignty and peace. The Transnistria sliver of the eastern side of Moldova has Russian military presence in it. It's not consequential, and I think the Russians in those motor rifle battalions in Transnistria would be very well served to not come out of Transnistria into Ukraine. They're not going to last very long if they do. But those non-NATO partners have had a long relationship with NATO, the Partnership for Peace, the American relationships for Ukraine, and for example, called the State Partnership Program, where the California National Guard has had a long relationship with Ukraine. The British have done extraordinary work in training the Ukrainian military, and the Russians are seeing the benefits of all of that with their, frankly, underwhelming military capabilities, coming up against what looks like a NATO force in reality. So we have an obligation as an alliance to strengthen the eastern frontier, and we'll see that with enhanced readiness forces in larger numbers being based there now. Though they may be rotational forces, but I think we're going to see the basing there. And we'll also see serious consideration at the Madrid summit of inducting 2 new members, Sweden and Finland. So, we'll see how this goes. But I think that the reconsiderations, as the minister said, the complete reconsiderations of the European security architecture is now on the table. And the worst nightmare that Putin could ever have envisaged by this invasion of Ukraine is coming to fruition and to reality right now. And we need to exercise this moment to strengthen NATO. Now, we have to be very careful not to inadvertently widen this conflict. And such comments as the outcome should be to weaken Russia, that plays in Moscow like the potential for a regime change. And they may well widen their willingness to take certain steps to defend themselves. The American president has said that Putin should not be permitted to continue to rule. So we got to be very careful what we say in public, because 2 things: it conveys a very clear message, potentially an existential message in Moscow. They probably deserve it, but it also has the effect in ad hoc coalitions. And I created and led an ad hoc coalition against the Islamic State. People joined these coalitions with a very clear mandate in mind. And the very clear mandate of this coalition was help Ukraine defend itself against Russian aggression, with the hope eventually of a victory, whatever that means, and the expulsion of Russian forces from Ukrainian territory and the restoration of its territorial integrity. When we start to talk about something bigger than that, then people are going to have to think hard about, in capitals, how they're able to justify that to their public. So we got to be careful to ensure that we control the escalation of this conflict and the widening of this conflict. It should be on our terms, not the Russians' terms, not Putin's terms.
Thank you, General. I want to follow up with a question of something which has kind of puzzled me over the past few months, which is that in the build-up to this, starting in November of last year, we saw a real variation in degrees of alarm amongst European countries, amongst NATO allies, with the US really at the forefront of trying to raise the alarm about what Russia's intentions were. Other countries in Europe didn't appear to share that assessment. I'm wondering if, first of all, what do you see as the reason for that discrepancy in the assessment of the risk in the build-up to this war, and how can we make sure that ahead of future crises that NATO allies are more firmly on the same page?
Well, I think the minister said it very well, and that is that national interests, absent a major crisis, and the invasion of Ukraine became a major crisis very quickly. But absent the invasion of a sovereign country, national interests were dominant in the thinking of countries with respect to how it would react, and its willingness to react to what looked like a Russian military buildup, long-term Russian military demonstrations along the border. And so national interests really were very much in the minds of leaders in capitals, and we shouldn't be surprised at that. In the end, we're all democracies. And thank God for what just happened in Paris. In France with respect to that democracy. So I think what you saw was, while these countries, our precious allies, all were still very committed to NATO, the idea that NATO would have to come together in the context of defending its eastern frontier from a Russian invasion of a peaceful country on the NATO frontier was still yet to be determined. And so right up to the moment that the first Russian tank turned to the south and came down the main axis of its invasion to try to knock Kyiv out of the conflict very quickly and present us with a fait accompli, right up to that moment, national interests really were still very much in the minds of leaders. And once that invasion occurred, I think what we saw was, and Germany is a magnificent example of it actually, the national interests suddenly were found to be very much in consonance with NATO interests and European interests and more broadly democratic interests. And let me just make a quick point. Freedom House, which is a think tank that has done a lot of work on democracy and the state of democracy in the world, Freedom House has charted yet again for roughly the 16th year in a row the decline of democracy around the world. So many citizens of this global world that we live in less free or unfree societies. And so one of the things that we should do at a strategic level in this moment of coherence, in this moment of unity and solidarity, is we need to think very, very hard about how the outcome of this strengthens democracy as a system of government and democracies in being able to see the world the same. Because I'll just tell the audience, please read the 4 February statement by the Russians and the Chinese. That manifesto, which is what it is, that manifesto is aimed directly at the heart of democracy as we know it. And this is why we should not be surprised at all that the Russians ultimately invaded. We shouldn't be surprised when people say, should we trust the Russians again? We shouldn't have to begin with. We should engage with them, but we shouldn't have to begin with. Democracy is really on the plate here. And the outcome of all of this should be how we as individual democracies, how we as an alliance, how we as a community of democracies globally, to include the Indo-Pacific, as the minister said, which has some of the finest high-functioning democracies on the planet, how we as a community of democracies come out of this crisis, hopefully having avoided catastrophe, but stronger as a system of government, stronger economically, and in a position where it isn't Russia and China who dictate the future of democracy and human rights and international law in the future. It's us, the democracies, who maintain the strength in our commitment to human rights and the rule of law and a system of government by the people, for the people.
Thank you, General. I think we have time for just one more question. And so I'd like to bring Alina back in to get her thoughts on a very pressing question, which is, the assessment now seems to be that I'm hearing from military analysts is that this could settle into being a very grinding war with Russia looking to wage a war of attrition. What does NATO need to do to support Ukraine so that it can ultimately win this war?
Well, unfortunately, I tend to think that those assessments are correct. We've seen Russia, first of all, fail in its initial strategy to quickly take Kiev. The Ukrainian resistance and the courage of the Ukrainian military pushed back that initial offensive. And now we've seen the Russian military regroup in the east, while at the same time launching massive attacks and bombings and missile attacks on the rest of Ukraine to weaken it. I think what we're seeing now is that this is not about the short term. As all of us, I think, here have said, this is really about ensuring that Ukraine can defend itself going forward for the foreseeable future. And the more security assistance, the more weapons that the NATO alliance, the NATO member states bring into Ukraine, that will actually make it much easier for Ukraine to eventually integrate into the alliance. Because de facto what's happening is that Ukraine's military force is being modernized at a much more rapid pace, of course, than would have been otherwise. But I think it also presents several challenges. If we're not thinking about the immediate short-term needs on the battlefield, how do we start thinking about investing in Ukraine's long-term military capabilities and democratic resilience? Very few democracies recover from a military conflict to become thriving democracies once again. Of course, Ukraine is a young democracy. So we need to be thinking about now is how do we prepare, not just for what's coming around the bend tomorrow on the battlefield, but what is coming around the bend in 6 to 12 months. And I think from a security perspective, from a NATO perspective, that means we need to start thinking about how do we invest in modernizing Ukraine's military force? How do we start building more partnerships to train Ukrainian military soldiers so they can use this new equipment they're being provided in a more effective way? How do we ensure that they can maintain and repair the equipment that they have? Right now, they're getting a lot of equipment that is, old Soviet era made stuff because they can readily deploy it on the battlefield, but that's not going to last for the duration of this war, which people like General Milley here in the United States have said multiple times that this will be likely a multi-year conflict. So we're going to be in this crisis mode for a long time. And I think as Minister said very, very aptly, for Europe, this presents also this broader challenge of dependence on Russia. If this war isn't going to end, how can we morally justify continuing to feed Putin's coffers by transferring billions and billions of dollars for energy supplies directly to Russia so Mr. Putin can continue to carry out this war? Those are the kinds of challenges ahead, and I think this is where the conversation is going. But it's going to take us a long time to really understand and start to put the kind of long-term capabilities in place to think about security, not just from a military perspective, but also from a broader resilience perspective.
Thank you, Alina. And whilst we could keep discussing this all day with our distinguished guests, I'm afraid we have to wrap up here. So General Allen, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, Captain Pfeifer, Alina, thank you so much for your time today, for sharing your insights with us. And I will now hand you back over to Lauren in Brussels.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you, Captain Pfeifer, for joining us in person. Such a great discussion. Thank you all so much.